Hi, everyone. I'm going to start the episode in just a second. This is editing Golan, who is going to add something before the episode starts. After I recorded this episode, which is specifically focusing on the subject of settlements, Israeli settlements and settler violence, I go through an entire explanation of why, legally speaking, settlements are not illegal. They can be frowned upon, etc. You'll see what I say in the episode. Since the recording of this episode, as of about 3 days ago, Joe Biden and his administration have reversed America's policy and declared that the settlements in Judea and Samaria are illegal. So this is shocking to me. I felt the need to record a preface to this episode as a result of that new information. Um, the thing that makes it crazy is that, and I go into a long explanation in the episode as to why settlements are not illegal, but the thing that makes it crazy is that this is based on a misreading of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's that you cannot move people into a land that you are occupying. Which presupposes that there is a specific land that a country has sovereignty over, that there are specific borders, that people are being forced movement like the Nazis did when they were taking over countries, which I also talk about. All of those things which do not apply in this situation explicitly, legally speaking. Now, there can be arguments about minutia, but ultimately there still has to be some kind of classification that this falls within, and it doesn't fall within that classification. Prior to 1967, Jordan had control of Judea and Samaria. They did not have sovereignty over that region. And the Palestinians didn't either. They don't have a legal state, and therefore it can be known as, at best, a disputed territory, and a disputed territory cannot be occupied. So for a lot of different reasons, and you can go and look a lot of this up as well, it just makes no sense that Biden has done this. I want to add one more thing as well. After Biden and his administration made this horrible decision, one of the arguments that they made, one of the things that they said to defend themselves was, well, we've always said, the America has always said that these settlements are illegal. Only the Trump administration deviated from that. This is a lie. Okay. The Carter administration was really the only one, and Carter was a raging anti-Semite. And, he was one of the people that furthered the Israel as apartheid myth, which is total garbage. So beyond him, Reagan's administration didn't feel that way. Bush's administration didn't feel that way. Even when you go through all the way down the line, everything was, it may have been frowned upon, but it wasn't illegal. And even Obama's White House, and Obama, no friend to the Jews, no friend to Israel, and those of you who didn't know that before certainly know that now, even under his administration, they were called illegitimate, but not illegal. And the one time they were called illegal, this was the statement: that settler outposts are illegal under Israel's own laws, not that they were declaring that settlements were illegal. And the outposts are illegal under Israel's law, and they're the ones that are often dismantled and taken down, or at the very least, not protected under Israeli law. So this is a deviation from American foreign policy. I hope that after you watch the episode, if you do decide to go look this up, see what Biden and his administration have done, which is unbelievably dangerous and unbelievably crass and craven, and obviously just a desperate plea for Arabs and Muslims who they don't trust to vote for him. They trust them as if they are all terror supporters. As if the only way to get them to come around, like the people in Michigan, is to kowtow to terrorists, as they've been doing over and over and over again. This is the cherry on top of a very disgusting Sunday made by an old man who is just frightened down to his bones that he's not going to get reelected, and thinks that the only way he can is to run to the craziest and most horrific people in his party. I hope that when you check this out, you take a look at the Fourth Geneva Convention. You take a look at the Oslo Accords, which Arafat signed and agreed that there were no set borders, and you see that this is ludicrous and outrageous. And immediately after Biden made that decision, Mike Pompeo from the previous administration immediately tweeted out, Judea and Samaria are rightful parts of the Jewish homeland, and Israelis have a right to live there. President Biden's decision to overturn their policy and call Israeli settlements illegal will not further the cause of peace. It rewards Hamas for its brutal attacks on October 7th and punishes Israel instead. These Israeli communities are not standing in the way of peace. Militant Palestinian terrorism is. Whether you like Mike Pompeo or not, he is absolutely right in this case. I'm shocked. I cannot believe this has happened. And mere hours after I finished editing the episode together, I don't even know what to say. I'm going to stop talking now and let you watch the rest of the episode. Watch it with this just absolutely abhorrent decision in mind. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Jew Can't Handle the Truth. In today's episode, we're going to be covering another myth that is dangerous and pervasive and, as usual, being used as a weapon against the Jews and the Jewish state to try to paint the Israelis as the bad guys in this equation. Falsely, of course. They have to keep trying. Lying about genocide didn't work. Lying about apartheid didn't work. Lying about ethnic cleansing didn't work. Lying about being refugees didn't work. Lying about UNRWA didn't work. Lying about how many people died didn't work. Lying about the Nakba didn't work. So here we are, talking about their latest lie, the myth of settler violence. Let's begin, as always, with a definition. What is it? What is settler violence? I'm sure you've heard about it before. You've heard that these settlers are bloodthirsty animals that are just taking down people in the occupied territories, all these particular words. So let's get into definitions. And to answer that question, we have to start by explaining areas A, B, and C. I know this is confusing. I started off talking about settlers. Now suddenly I'm talking about areas. Trust me, it'll all line up. Per the Oslo Accords, Judea and Samaria were split up into 3 parts. Area A, B, and C. Area A is completely under Palestinian rule. That's where Holocaust denier Mahmoud Abbas runs the PLO out of. Area B is also under Palestinian rule, but Israel shares security control with them there. And Area C is completely under Israeli rule. Okay, next we have to define settlers and settlements. I told you I'd get back to it. As I like to do, I'm going to go right to the most terrorist news outlet I can find for a definition, so I can't be accused of whitewashing anything later. So here we go. Per Jihad Daily. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. It's actually called Al Jazeera. So close. My mistake. Potato, really. Anyway, per Al Jazeera, the Qatari-funded terrorist news outlet, settlements are wherever Jews are in Israel. Whoa. Yeah, no, Al Jazeera said that. That's right. Yes. According to this apparently well-respected and often quoted news outlet that actually employs real rapists and murderers, yeah, they literally say that Tel Aviv is a settlement in the Arab city of Jaffa. So I don't know how we win here. Apparently everything in Israel is all settlements. All Jews need to be from the river to the sea, all that good stuff. I think Al Jazeera might be too terrorist on this one, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt, as I like to do, and see where this goes. No, oh, here we go. I found a little less Hamasi definition of settler. Quote, settlers are Israeli citizens who live on private Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, unquote. Just going to pause for a moment and jump in real quick with some reality checks. First, for context, the West Bank is what everyone seems to call Judea and Samaria these days. The name the West Bank refers to the Western Bank of Jordan, so this cutesy nickname is just another way to deny Jewish connection to their indigenous, ancestral homeland. Until now, most Israelis didn't care. We were fine with that. Who cares what you call it? It's like the old philosophical saying, if you call a dog's tail a leg, it still only has 4 legs and a tail. But now I'm realizing that all these words that we've allowed to have the meaning be skewed a tiny bit here, a tiny bit there, those minor degrees over time become a situation where they just like to scream genocide, even though there isn't one. So no more. It's time for us to reclaim the name, like what Ukraine did after Russia invaded. Kiev was Kiev forever, but it turned out that's the Russian pronunciation. Now that it's being attacked by the very people whose name they were using, they want their real name back, and they want us all to use it too, and we do. Kiev, and so it shall be with us. We're done with this West Bank horseshit. It's Judea and Samaria. It always has been, and it will continue to be. Second of all, these supposed settlements are in Area C of Judea and Samaria, which we've already established is Israeli-run. While that's important to note, it's also beside the point, as you'll see in a moment. I could go on a really long rant about what many call the 1967 borders, aka the Green Line, which is really just the 1949 armistice demarcation line, which exists and has only existed as agreed upon ceasefire lines between the Israelis and the Arabs, and is understood by all parties involved, even those that now call for a return to 1967 borders. They all know that the 1949 armistice demarcation lines can only become concrete, can only be considered borders in any legal way, once a permanent peace agreement is signed with the offending belligerent, which in this case would be Hamas. They know that, we know that, and anybody who is saying otherwise is either lying to you, to themselves, or to the world at large. You see, there are no 1967 borders. It's a lie. It's another lie. As pointed out by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, these supposed borders are not based on historical fact, natural geographic formation, demographic consideration, or international agreement. They have never figured in any of the international agreed upon documentation concerning the Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian issues. They have no basis whatsoever, neither in law nor in fact, period. And all the people in charge on both sides know it. I'll go into all this another time, as it's a subject ripe for an episode of its own, but I just needed to give you that context for what's coming. 1967 borders don't exist legally. Third, and more importantly, is that these supposed settlements are not illegal. We can dislike them. We can think they're politically motivated. We can think they're politically stupid or counterintuitive. We can dislike Bibi for pushing them. We can agree with Obama's White House, their official stance that they're illegitimate but not illegal. But nothing in that entire list, and nothing anyone else can ever say, will make settlements illegal. Even the UN, no friend to Israel, and now we know a straight-up supporter of actual terrorists, passed a resolution, Resolution 242, way back in 1967, just as Israel had won the war that they had not started and took control back of Judea and Samaria and of the Gaza Strip. Some people like to misinterpret what Resolution 242 says, but there's ample evidence, ample information, and ample interviews with those who drafted it that show precisely what was intended by it. I'm going into this because it's important for you to understand that this is not something that's illegal, even while people like to complain about it as if it is. Resolution 242 explicitly gives Israel the right to run however they see fit the territories that Israel acquired in 1967 until they reach, and I'm quoting here, quote, a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, unquote. It further goes out of its way to not define what the borders would be post-peace negotiations, because Israel had taken those lands in a defensive war, as in one they didn't start, and then they were stopping other people from trying to kill them, like now. You see, there's a rule that you can't keep land you acquire in a war, but that rule applies to when you are the one who started the war, not when you were attacked and then took land that, if kept by the aggressor, would allow you to be attacked again, right? Think about it. There would be no deterrent in place to stop people from starting wars. I tried to take over Kentucky, but they beat my ass and took half my state of Missouri. Luckily, the UN says they have to give it back, so I'll just try again next year. No, I don't think so. If you try to kill me and I stop you and I take away your weapon, it's not theft. And when the Palestinian terrorists use their land as a weapon against Israel, sorry, Charlie, that shit doesn't belong to you anymore. That would be the equivalent of seeing a terrorist group murder a bunch of innocents in grotesque ways, kidnap babies, use their own children as human shields, build their terrorist headquarters in hospitals, under kindergartens, and then see the president of the United States calling for a ceasefire and consider giving them a state. It would send the wrong message to all bad actors to just emulate the exact behavior to get whatever you want. I mean, that could never happen though, right? Right? Oh, Jesus Christ, Biden's right behind me, isn't he? Anyway, America's horrific foreign policy aside, for those of you who hate Watch My Stuff, I'm sure you're thinking that I'm some damn Zionist and what I'm about to say is alleged land grabs by Israel, right? It's all unfair, right? Well, even Arafat and the PLO signed on to that resolution, that being the point from which negotiations can begin. And at the time, they were the sole representatives of the so-called Palestinian people. Of course, they did that not because they wanted the 1967 borders to be malleable out of fairness, but for far more nefarious purposes. Obviously, as usual, they didn't want any concrete borders in writing, so they could later say that all of Israel was still in play, like they're doing today, from the river to the sea, as usual. Well, tough shit, terrorists. In signing on that the borders were still open for conversation, you waived the idea of 1967 borders altogether, no matter how many times your genocidal minions shout about it in the streets of Melbourne as they're beating up Jews and the cops are arresting the Jews for their trouble. To simplify this in layman's terms, because I know that's a lot of resolutions and this and that, it means that Israel has to, at some point, give up part of the land that they got once the people around them aren't trying to kill them every day. By the way, I'm emphasizing part of the land, part, not all, because calls from the Arabs and the Russians at the time to specifically include the words all the land were called and were summarily rejected after a long debate. In fact, one of the men in charge of drafting the resolution, Lord Caradon, just in case you're not sure or it's ambiguous, he went so far as to say it out loud. And I quote the man: "The withdrawal envisioned by the resolution would not be from all the territories." Unquote. Pretty clear. He later further clarified, once again, I quote, "It would have been wrong to demand that Israel return its positions of June 4th, 1967, because these positions were undesirable and artificial." Unquote. In case that's not clear enough for you, the American ambassador at the time, Arthur Goldberg, said, and I quote again, "The notable omissions, which were not accidental," those are his words, not accidental, "in regards to withdrawal are the words the, all, and June 5th, 1967 lines." Unquote. He went on to say, quote again, "The resolution speaks of withdrawal from occupied territories without defining the extent of the withdrawal." Unquote. Period. Since Israel has already handed over Sinai back to Egypt, withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and handed over areas A and B to the Palestinian Authority, all of which covers about 94% of the territories that they got, they've already fulfilled more than their part of the bargain, and they did it even before the murderers around them stopped murderously trying to murder them. That's all good faith, baby, and nobody seems to give a shit, but it happened. There's one more thing I have to tell you about, and that's the Fourth Geneva Convention. I'm sure you've heard by now of the Geneva Convention, even if you don't know the parts of it and the exact phraseology. I'm sure, if nothing else, you've heard it used as a weapon against Israel, right? You broke the Geneva Convention, war crime, blah, blah, blah. Because the Fourth Geneva Convention states, and I quote, "An occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies." This is used to show that Israel is like violating international law, and therefore they're war criminals, it's ethnic cleansing, it's genocide, it's apartheid, it's whatever other words they decide to use. I'm telling you this so you understand the legality of the situation, and also because it will undoubtedly come up if you're ever talking to fans of Hamas like Mark Ruffalo or AOC or Bernie Sanders, good Jew. And I want you to have the tools to respond. So here's a brief on this. First of all, as we've already established, there are no set borders in this equation, and therefore it can't legally be called an occupation anyway, even though we've all gotten used to saying the occupied territories. So maybe we all stop saying that. Jews shouldn't be using their words that are also inaccurate to describe our situation. But honestly, it's too late for that. We've been saying it for too long. That argument won't be convincing to many, so let's move on. According to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, quote, "Both the text of the Fourth Geneva Convention and the post-World War II circumstances under which it was drafted clearly indicate that it was never intended to refer to situations like Israel's settlements." In an attempt at clarification, even the Jew haters who don't hand out medicine to hostages over at the International Committee of the Red Cross say that the article in the convention relating to this article, Article 49, is referring to situations where populations are coerced into being transferred. It was written specifically to combat things like the Nazis' Lebensraum policy, in which they invaded countries, then forcibly moved their own people into those countries. This is not the case with Israel settlements. The Arab states even inadvertently admitted that this was not the case in 1998 when they tried to alter the text of the Fourth Convention to make it include Israel settlements, because it didn't. Terrorist supporting groups like Amnesty International, the United Nations, and the Squat, that's what I lovingly call the Squad, just love to leave that part out when accusing Israel of whatever they're accusing Israel of this time. But it's important for you to be aware that it matters. The Oslo Accords, also signed by both sides, took this one step further and set up a framework for all sorts of stuff, including the settlements. Quoting from the GCPA again, quote, "In this framework, there is no specific provision restricting planning, zoning, and continued construction by either party. There isn't one, and they signed it, and nobody forced them to." Most importantly of all, Judea and Samaria have been home to the Jews for thousands of years. They were attacked and occupied by the most colonizing force in the history of mankind, the Muslim Arabs. Once the land fell back into Israel's hands, they were able to once again live where they had lived for many years prior to the invading army stealing it from them. Again, to metaphor the whole thing, if you break into my house and take over my living room, it's still my living room. You're just an interloper there. If you then later try to take over my kitchen too, and I not only stop you, but I do such a good job that I even get my living room back, I'm not colonizing your room. It was fucking mine when you took it, and it's still fucking mine when I take it back. In other words, the Fourth Geneva Convention simply doesn't apply here, no matter how many times it's mentioned in a TikTok dancing video by a non-binary terror supporter. Okay, so now you know what's up with the borders, you know what's up with the areas, and we get that the so-called settlers are people living legally in parts of Area C in the Israeli-controlled parts of Judea and Samaria. Side note, there are also illegal settlements there, per Israeli law, and the Israelis often go in and dismantle them, like they did with the 18 settlements in Sinai and the 21 settlements in Gaza. Now, they haven't done it with all of them, and they should, but even that doesn't change what I'm about to go into in terms of the actual violence being perpetrated by these people. So, all the preface stuff is done. On to the main course. What's up with all this violence the settlers are perpetrating that everyone seems to be talking about? Settler violence is something being discussed a lot lately as a means of showing the world how it's actually the Jews that are the violent ones. In order to believe that, of course, you have to completely be blind, deaf, and dumb, ignore that every single time the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, or whatever they want to call themselves, are going out to march, to meet, to chant, whatever it is, they're always violent, always, 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 always violent. They're always calling for violence to occur. And when it does, they always cheer it on. When someone shows up and badmouths the terrorists in their quote unquote humanitarian march, they always attack the person attacking the terrorists. So we have to pretend for a moment that we don't know that obviously the Jews are not the violent ones. But that's the whole purpose of this rhetoric. In fact, if you look at when a lot of this bullshit started becoming, let's call it mainstream, it would seem like, in retrospect, it was setting something up, namely October 7th. What do I mean by that? If you were about to commit a genocide and you knew you needed to immediately change the subject from your perpetration of another Holocaust, what would you do? Well, you'd start to plant stories about how the true genocide was happening at the hands of the victims that you were about to rape and torture and slaughter and kidnap. Makes a perverse amount of sense, doesn't it? If you could, before even launching your violent and heinous attack on civilians, pre-convince the world that the civilians were the ones at fault, wouldn't you? I mean, if you were a sociopathic murderous terrorist. When looking at the planted news stories, you can see it emerge. To illustrate this, we're going to put aside all the typical terrorist-supporting, Jew-hating websites that hide their one-sided racism and blatant anti-Semitism behind important-sounding names like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's a real name, of a pro-Hamas group, or the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, another real name, or the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, another real name, or Teen Vogue. Yeah, that's I don't even know what to say. By the way, side note, isn't it interesting how these pro-Hamas sites are all international and so many of them seem to be for nonviolence and peace? It's in their names. You know, I saw a word cloud done recently by a Harvard student transcribing based on pro-terrorist riots, in which that student recorded the most said words and phrases used across the world by this group. Here's a sampling of some of the top 50 that were found to be repeated ad nauseum. Free Palestine was first, of course. They forgot to add from Hamas, but these aren't the brightest bulbs on the tree, so I guess we can't blame them. Zionists actually tied for first because that's the word they use to say dirty Jew, but in a way that somehow, and I really don't get how, doesn't get them in trouble. It's like back when racists were saying thug to replace the N-word, but were called out immediately for the nice try of it all. Nobody seems to give a fuck when racist dog whistles are used for the Jews. Next was From the River to the Sea, which calls for murder and genocide. Globalize the Intifada was up there, which calls for the death of Jews everywhere, not just in Israel. Nazis, of course, 1948. Apartheid, they love talking about their made-up Nakba, which we covered in the last episode, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point of all this is that the word they don't use is peace. And yet so many of their Hamas cheerleading websites are named after peace. Just an interesting tidbit. Back to the point. To illustrate the preconditioning of the American and worldwide populace to the idea of the Jews as aggressors and the narrative that October 7th was merely a retaliation, a response, a reply to that aggression, they needed to get these stories into the mainstream as quickly as possible. So, as I said, we're ignoring their normal propaganda websites and focusing on the big boys. We'll start with this. One of the most visible, widespread, and unsubstantiated news stories about settler aggression was spread via the Associated Press. To understand why that's important, the AP, as it's known, is a news agency that feeds stories and research/information to a whole host of major U.S. daily newspapers, as well as to radio and TV broadcasters. They call themselves, quote, the definitive source, unquote. Everyone from the New York Times to the Washington Post draws from the AP, and everyone in between. In other words, if it's printed in the AP, it's going to go wide. So, what was the news story, and when was it planted? Here's the headline. UN report says West Bank settler violence has displaced over 1,100 Palestinians since 2022. This article was published by the AP on September 21st, 2023. Oh, man, the UN released that report totally by chance, I'm sure, just under the wire, only about 2 weeks before their terrorist partners launched their rape and dismember attack against pregnant women, the elderly, children, and unarmed civilians in general. Well, luckily for those very terrorists that desperately needed propaganda that dumb people online would swallow, especially in light of all their raping and chopping people up, this news story told the world that settler violence against Palestinians was at the highest rate as of 2023 since 2006, when they began recording such things. There's not one example of settler violence actually given in the whole article. So I guess we're just meant to believe the UN report and the Palestinian self-reporting because both groups have been so impartial on the subject of Israel thus far. Why do I bring this up? Because much like the Students for Justice in Palestine had their hate march material referencing the October 7th massacre already in hand before the massacre actually occurred, and were already marching against Israeli aggression and calling for a ceasefire after the events of that horrible day, but before Israel even launched a defensive attack, these news stories provide cover for terrorists. To simplify, it was set up ahead of time through collusion. If the news is already out there that the Israelis are attacking constantly, causing violence, sending innocent Arabs fleeing from their homes in fear, etc., then the argument that the October 7th attack isn't when this all started is already in progress. It's just another event in a series of events, probably as a result of Israeli aggression. I read it in the AP. You see how that works? And if you look back at all of the news stories about this particular topic, or even the non-news stories that are planted on quote-unquote civilian websites like Quora, or even on social media, a lot of the rhetoric about settler attacks began around 2023. Not all of it, but it certainly ramped up right around then. Considering that there's ample evidence that they were planning the attacks of October 7th for years prior, this means likely that these planted stories, whether journalistic or civilian casual, were part of their battle plan. All you need to do is look at Instagram and TikTok to see that these people are good at two things: killing Jews and successfully lying to people. And the two are more connected than you know. Again, sure, there were news stories here and there about the topic. I found one from 2021, for instance, on a website called, get ready for this name, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. It's a website run by an anti-Semitic hate group called B'Tselem, which masquerades as a Jewish group, like JVP. They're very similar. See my previous video about so-called Jewish groups that hate Jews for more info. So beyond that article and a few other disparate ones that were planted before that, this really wasn't part of the major conversation until much more recently. As if there was a reason for it. As if it was building to something. Today, I'm going to make the case that it was building to this. That it was building to become part of the propaganda campaign of that very October 7th genocidal attack and its aftermath. To do this, let's review the reality versus the way the news is reported, the documented evidence of crimes, the actual hard proof, and the reactions that occurred as a result of all of it, not by useful idiot schmucks or online racists looking for a reason to be racist, but by actual governments affecting actual policy. Let's dig deeper into the deaths that supposedly came from so-called settler violence in Judea and Samaria. Some claim it's 29 Arabs. Some claim it's nearly 500. Considering the numbers are being reported by terrorist regimes who lie about every number they can get their hand on, we have to question everything, lest we forget that on October 19th, Gaza officials reported that 307 people died, 671 of which were children. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Okay, forget that one. Let's use this other example. On October 26th, Gaza declared that 481 people died, 626 of which were children. Well, it's no better. I know what's going on. This is a new special math called total horseshit. Luckily, it's reported by the Palestinian Ministry of Health, so you know it's true. Oh, excuse me, I'm being told that the Palestinian Ministry of Health is just Hamas. Straight up, just terrorists, rapists, and murderers. It's weird how few mainstream news sources mention that the terrorists themselves are the ones reporting death numbers in which adult-age men somehow hardly feature. In fact, let me just run some numbers here. I'm pretending to type for effect. Okay, according to Hamas, all of Israel's attacking of Gaza, all of it, the bombing, the shooting, the sniping, has only resulted in 2 to 3% of the entire number of dead being adult-aged men. Wow, that's so odd. It's almost unbelievable. Unless you're on TikTok. Somehow, if you're on TikTok, you'll believe anything. As for the Palestinian Ministry of Health, I'm surprised Hamas didn't name it the International Palestinian Ministry of Health for Researching Nonviolent Peace. That would have gone a long way to making it sound even more legitimate. I know you got your hands full with a bunch of hostages you ripped from their homes, but step it up, guys. Do better. Come on, that name sucks. Anyway, back to Judea and Samaria. So when we look at all the news coming out about so-called settler violence, a pattern emerges, and it doesn't take a lot to spot it. Article after article from the mainstream media, and don't forget Qatari-financed Hamas mouthpiece Nazi storefront Al Jazeera, shouting the headlines about Israeli settler attacks. But when you read the actual article, what you will find is a severe lack of details, as well as a few interesting tidbits that recur consistently through all of them. The unspoken part of each article, and sometimes explicitly spoken only way down in the article, like in paragraph 23, is that there is no evidence of most of this rash of settler violence, and certainly no evidence that the so-called settler violence wasn't self-defense. That's consistent throughout all the articles I read. And in my research, that was hundreds of articles, so not a bad sample size. The thing that's consistent is that it's all just hearsay, announced as though it were fact, or cherry-picking individual examples that are few and far between in order to make it look like an epidemic, when it's not one. By the way, that paragraph 23 crack was not just a random exaggerated number. That's exactly how long it takes a Reuters article from November 2nd to tell us that there's no evidence of anything mentioned in the 22 paragraphs above. Despite that lack of evidence, they still title the article, Israeli settler attacks fuel the fire as Gaza war rages. Let's use this article as an example of how these things are being reported on. Falsely. First, the article begins by telling you how terrible the dirty, dirty Jews are. Then it quotes a Muslim guy who says the Jews, quote, shoot to kill. Then it talks about settler violence being at a 15-year high. Then it calls Judea and Samaria the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And then they call Hamas a militant group. So far, so good. Seems totally balanced. Next paragraph. They tell you all about 3 Muslims that were killed by settlers, only they leave out that they very much were not killed by settlers. Not even a little bit. So in other words, they are straight up lying to you. These particular Muslims mentioned in the article as killed by settlers were killed by Israeli troops. You might think, well, those dastardly Israeli troops going after poor innocent Muslims. That's not any better. But the other thing they leave out is that the troops killed them after the troops were attacked by the very people the article laments. The dead people were the aggressors and had their terroristic attempt at Jewish genocide, which, remember, they have promised to do out loud until all the Jews are dead, quashed. They died through a defensive act by troops, not even settlers. And that defensive act eventually killed the Muslims, which it seems they deserved. So how did the article get it all so, let's be charitable and call it wrong? Well, some other Muslims who claim to be witnesses claim some settlers started it. They leave out the Muslim-led attack. They leave out the troops. They leave out the defensive maneuver. So Reuters simply obliges them by reprinting that blood libel. There's a saying that goes, quote, if Israel explains what happened, the press won't print it until it's 100% verified by outside sources. If the Muslims explain what happened, it is immediately printed with no verification necessary. For instance, it only took the press until January or February to finally admit what Israel had been saying for months, that Hamas uses hospitals as terrorist bases. The New York Times ran a story about it 3 months later, after their own, quote, trusted sources finally verified it. But it turns out they'd known about Hamas using Al-Shifa as a base since 2008. And the New York Times verified that again in 2014. Somehow, they waited for terror supporters to riot in the streets based on their article, to attack the cops based on their article, to lie on social media based on their article, and for Jews to be targeted and killed based on their article before they printed a retraction. As for Muslim claims, we already know they get printed, often without a caveat. CNN just this week reported unsubstantiated claims of sexual abuse of Palestinian women by Israeli soldiers with 0 precise details, 0 proof, and 0 actual complaints filed. Just based on the UN, and I'm not kidding when I say this, claiming they heard about, and I quote, multiple forms of sexual assault. CNN, in that same article, went on to call terrorists fighters, quoting directly from Hamas's press release, but without attribution. They did mention in the second to last paragraph that there's no evidence and CNN can't verify any allegations. This in an article entitled, quote, UN experts demand investigation into claims Israeli forces killed, raped, and sexually assaulted Palestinian women and girls, unquote. Oh, long title, and also fair and balanced, I'd say. Well done, everybody. What's more, when it comes to Muslim claims later, when their often manufactured bullshit turns out to be 100% false, the press sometimes offers up a mea culpa retraction that no one ever sees. Or in the case of the New York Times, after blaming Israel and even publishing a fake photo of a bombed-out hospital to make that false accusation stick, printed a half-hearted editor's note entitled Gaza Hospital Coverage. 6 days later, in which they say somewhere deep in the editor's note, they, quote, relied too heavily on information from a terrorist organization, unquote. And then went on to print information from that very terrorist organization again, without vetting it again, over and over again, for months afterwards. Better yet, in the case of the BBC, the international editor who parroted Hamas's lies and whose decisions directly led to maimed and dead Jews just said, go fuck yourself. Wait, that's not cool. Sorry. To be fair, I'll quote him directly when asking about him regurgitating terrorist lies that caused untold damage and violence. I want to be fair, so these are his words. He said, and I quote, I don't regret one thing in my reporting. I was wrong, but I don't feel too bad about it, unquote. Much better. A real peach, that one. Or even better yet still, you could be like that piece of shit, murder-supporting, Hamas-financed, rapist apologist, terrorist mouthpiece Rashida Tlaib, and simply just keep saying the lie without secession. No repercussions. Anyway, back to the settler coverage, which I hope by now you're getting the point is biased as hell and possibly all based on false accusations with no proof. The next thing they say in that article we've been talking about is that since October 7th, there have been more than, and I quote, 170 attacks on Palestinians involving settlers, unquote. Involving. By settlers? No. Involving settlers. That word is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It's kind of like a context black hole, like when you go see your friends play and afterwards tell her it was interesting, or kind of like saying someone died with COVID instead of from COVID. What does that mean? Is that a stat or just a talking point? Well, in this case, we won't know the context, the one about settler violence, until that aforementioned 23rd paragraph, which at this point we're nowhere near. So we're just absorbing all the lies, all the anti-Jewish bullshit. For the sake of all of us, I'll speed through the rest of this. They go on to say that the settlers all have automatic weapons, which is not true, that clashes with settlers are often deadly, which is not true. They denigrate National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, criticize the Israeli government for arming their citizens after October 7th, which, duh, call settlers vigilantes, tell us how worried the ordinary Palestinians are, talk about all the other places taking Israel to task for these unsubstantiated and super rare outbreaks of violence that, based on all the available evidence, seem to mostly occur when the settlers are attacked and then defend themselves. I say mostly because, sure, there's always the possibility of a bad apple here and there. I don't want to pretend every settler is mentally stable, but the evidence doesn't seem to bear out a lot of crazy settlers going all John Wick on some peaceful Palestinian musicians and yogis just out for a love-in picnic on a fucking summer day. At this point, I'm only halfway through the article, if you can believe that. In screenwriting parlance, we're at the midpoint of the story, and this is when the, let's be kind and call them journalists, do their best to justify Hamas's October 7th Holocaust, saying that, quote, Hamas cited Israeli actions in the West Bank, core to a would-be Palestinian state, in waging its killing spree, unquote. Let me paraphrase Reuters. October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. I won't summarize the rest of the article, except to say three more things. One, this is one of the kinder, gentler articles on the subject. The others, and I have read many articles about this in my research, go even harder, vilifying the Jews, blatantly painting them as genocidal and making the Muslims out to be nothing but innocent victims. I doubt I need to remind you, but I will anyway, that the Muslims in Judea and Samaria support Hamas even more than the people in Gaza do. According to our precious Associated Press, the Muslims in Judea and Samaria are fans of Hamas at a rate of 90%. These poor, peace-loving, innocent victims of crazy Israeli settler aggression just love them some terrorists and love them some rape and murder. It's a weird dichotomy that the press chooses to ignore when, let's be kind and call it reporting on this particular topic. Number two, along the way, deep in the article, Reuters admits that there's no evidence of who shot anyone, and that they themselves aren't saying that one side or the other is right. But their headline, quote, Israeli settler attacks fuel the fire, unquote, seems to indicate otherwise. So fair, so balanced, once you read the small print, of course, deep in the article. Number three, in this article, long after everyone has already stopped reading, long after everyone has already made up their mind that these settlers are bloodthirsty animals mowing down old men on their way to funerals, I might add, that according to the articles are for their dead children that were also mowed down by these Jew jackals, apparently. Long after all that is done and established and set in stone and locked into the minds of the gullible and those who don't know how to verify information they're being propagandized with, long after all that, in that aforementioned paragraph 23, Reuters says this, wait for it, and I quote, clashes with soldiers have caused most of the deaths, unquote. According to the actual statistics and facts and evidence, not just bullshit and TikTok videos and on CNN, nearly every one of the deaths mentioned in these articles are of Hamas and Fatah Palestinian terrorists, killed by the Israeli military in counterterrorism operations, taking out bomb and weapon factories, as well as terrorist safe houses in the regions of Nablus, Jenin, and Hebron, the three primary breeding grounds for terrorists in Judea and Samaria. And the ones that don't fall into that category were almost exclusively acts of self-defense. So wait, with that information, am I telling you that the whole article and pretty much all the others like it are total garbage? All lies? Yes. Yes, I am. All of these things they write that tell us about settler violence for paragraph after paragraph, double-digit paragraphs. The information is so widespread, despite there being meager evidence to show that this is a real problem and not some outlier rarity, that Germany, the EU, Belgium, the UN, and many others felt the need to comment on it, to admonish Israel for it. They made public statements in the press about this. Even the United States saw President Biden take to the Washington Post opinion page to lambaste Israel for these violent settlers. Very brave of him. He went so far, and I'm not exaggerating here, as to threaten to withhold sales of M16s to the Israeli army in the midst of a two-front war, mind you, that he himself set a ridiculous and untenable deadline for, all due to this so-called rash of settler violence. And later, Biden even implemented a travel ban on what he called, quote, Israeli extremist settlers, unquote. The US government was very careful to leave out how many people this travel ban would actually affect, saying that the action would be taken against a, quote, undisclosed number of individuals. Turns out, it's about 4 people. No, that's not an exaggeration. I feel like I have to keep saying that because all of this is so ludicrous. There are literally only 4 people named in this thing, 3 of whom are already arrested by Israel for their crimes because that's what a moral and law-abiding society does. And the 4th case is being investigated. One of the 4 people affected by this ruling is accused of attacking other Israelis, not even Arabs at all. All that is to say that the whole specter of the press lying about all this in such a bald-faced manner, without any checks and balances, has caused real damage. Just looking at the US's response alone showcases how dangerous this all is. All the government's op-eds against Israel, all the administration's private Jew-bashing speeches in Michigan, all the Islamophobia initiatives they've passed during a time when hate crimes against Jews are skyrocketing, all the president's comments about Israel's response being over the top. It's all performative. It's all based on the press proliferating this lie. And that gives cover to a weak-old man begging for votes, even if it means playing to terror supporters. It's shameful. Just look at how they compare the two sides, using this distorted nonsense as a foundation. They first say not to condemn all Palestinians for Hamas's actions, despite Hamas being supported overwhelmingly by the Palestinians, and despite the Palestinians voting Hamas into power, while at the same time condemning the entire country of Israel for a few bad actors who are not supported by the country or its people writ large, were not voted into any office, do not represent the values or ethics of a Jewish state as a whole, and are condemned and often prosecuted by the very people being admonished by the outside world. To quote Ryan Jones, writer and editor for Israel Today, this is merely an easy way for the US to desperately grasp for a moral equivalence that will shift the narrative and distract everyone from the truth, unquote. Don't believe that? Check this out. Joe Biden has recently drafted a resolution for the UN to consider voting on that would ask Israel to adhere to yet another ceasefire. A ceasefire. For context, there was a ceasefire on October 7th when the terrorists perpetrated the greatest crime against the Jews since the Holocaust. Per capita, transplanted to America, that attack would have been the equivalent of murdering, beheading, burning alive, dismembering, kidnapping, and raping 40,000 to 50,000 Americans. Now they're asking for us to think about a ceasefire. Per capita, it's the most horrific terror attack in all of recorded history. And it happened during a ceasefire. There was also a ceasefire in place on November 29th when Hamas violated the hostage exchange agreement and launched rockets into civilian centers. There was a ceasefire in place on November 30th when Hamas sent 2 operatives to a street corner in Jerusalem to fire randomly at people on the street. Should we go further back before 2023? Come on, let's do it. 2022, Hamas broke a ceasefire. 2021, Hamas broke a ceasefire. 2020, Hamas broke a ceasefire. 2019, Hamas broke a ceasefire. 2018, you guessed it, Hamas broke a ceasefire. Let's jump back to 2014. Hamas broke 12 ceasefires in 1 year. You get the point. So who exactly are we ceasing to fire with? Desperate for votes, Joe Biden, and desperate for dead Jews, mainstream media? The people who don't keep their word on ceasefires and who have vowed to try to genocide and ethnically cleanse the Jews worldwide the first chance they get, regardless of what ceasefire's in place? If that's not a performative gesture to dog whistle to Biden's Ilhan Omar level genocidal base, I don't know what is. And this false story that went around the world before the truth could get his shoes on allowed the whole administration to get involved in Jew bashing. When our illustrious word salad aficionado vice president met with Israel's president in the middle of a war they didn't start, she felt the need not to show support, but first to bring up to him how he had to, quote, hold extremist settlers accountable for violent acts, unquote. The State Department went on to make vague yet threatening sounding statements about it to the press. And in some other performative move, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and New York Congressman and an heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, Dan Goldman, both encouraged Biden to say something about these dastardly settlers. Weirdly, right after they were both harassed by the pro-Hamas crowd, Booker first when he was shouted down by Hamas supporters during a speech on November 6th, and then later, good Jew Goldman when his office was vandalized by the same lovely group of terror and rape apologists on November 16th. Goldman, after some additional pressure from the Jew haters in his district, also later said he would love a ceasefire. Again, with who? You can see how dangerous this kind of fiction can be when in the wrong hands. So what is the actual truth about settler violence? I'll let someone who dived even deeper than I did respond to that. A guy named David Weinberg is a founding senior fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy in Jerusalem. He went directly to Shin Bet. It's Israel's main security agency, and he asked for their detailed and precise statistics on the matter. I'll quote his assessment, which was published in the Jerusalem Post, verbatim. Quote, "It is crystal clear that there has not been a significant increase in right-wing Israeli Jewish violence against Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria since the beginning of the current Gaza war compared to the period of January through July 2023, unquote. He explains that August and September of 2023 actually had less violence than the previous year, then goes on to say, quote, "The more serious type of incidents dropped by 50% as compared to last year," unquote. Finally, he says, quote, "There is no evidence whatsoever of the wild accusation that 600 Palestinians from 13 communities were forced to abandon their homes due to fear of settler attacks," unquote. Remember that one? From the planted story in the Associated Press 2 weeks before the terrorists launched their attack? Of course, there are some people who just break the law. The same goes for the Jews in Judea and Samaria. Find a place where no crime happens. Good luck. The difference is that when Jews perpetrate violence or vandalism or intimidation, the Jewish state goes after them and prosecutes them for it. Unlike the Palestinian government, who literally pays suicide bombers' families for their now dead relatives' crimes. As a thank you. Pay for slay, it's called. The other difference is that with the Jews of Judea and Samaria, we're talking about a vanishingly small group of anarchic dissidents amongst a population of over 500,000. Whereas the Palestinians overwhelmingly celebrate and support terrorism, teaching about their bloodthirsty and murderous so-called martyrs in schools as if they are heroes. The myth of settler violence is one that is built to try to falsely balance the actions on both sides of this war. Sure, the Palestinians did a terrible thing on October 7th, but it's time to forget that. This was the message, actually, of the prime minister of the terrorist group known as the Palestinian Authority, less than a week ago. It's time to move on and make peace, he said, because Israel also did a bunch of bad stuff, like all these settlers murdering all these innocents in the so-called West Bank. Only that didn't happen. There's a thing called a straw man argument. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it is, quote, "an intentionally misrepresented proposition that is set up because it is easier to defeat than an opponent's real argument," unquote. This is the epitome of that. They build up this fallacious case, not only with no evidence, but with the evidence showing the exact opposite of what they're claiming. According to Douglas Altabef, chairman of the board of Im Tirtzu and director of the Israel Independence Fund, They do this in order to use it as a, quote, moral counterweight to Hamas, unquote, comparing it to dirt under Israel's fingernails being equated to blood dripping from Palestinian hands. It's about time, like all the other lies being spread by the pro-terror crowd, that someone stop this one from proliferating. Much like the Nakba narrative. I didn't know that this was a manufactured thing, that it was just fiction created with the aim of hurting Israel and propping up a genocidal ideology. I started the research on this one just to find out if the settler violence was as bad as it was being reported, if it was widespread enough to warrant US policy changes. What I discovered was much worse. Once I discovered that it was all built on lies, this went from what was meant to be a short segment into an entire episode. I hope, as always, that this was helpful. I hope it was informative. As always, I thank you for listening to what turned out to be a lot of jargon and a lot of history. I thank you for allowing me to be a resource. Until next time, stay strong, stay safe, and Am Yisrael Chai.